and that's continued for a couple of years till they found out that Queensland was cheaper, so we lost it. And then the really big break came with the Sydney Olympics. Dennis was in charge of 1,200 athletes and officials from 17 different countries who did the pre-Olympic training here in Adelaide. And even at the time, not many people realised what was going on. But obviously Dennis has over the years gone from strength to strength. I'm actually amazed that I've kind of pinned him down for tonight, because half the time I have absolutely no idea if he's in Adelaide, interstate or overseas, because over the last couple of years he travels the world doing tour guide training. He travels the world taking groups all around the world, and about 4 or 5 years ago he thought he got enough time to start a hobby, and he started a YouTube channel doing reviews of all the airlines in the world. And I know for a fact there are actually a few people here who follow it. There's only a few of the hundreds of thousands of people follow Dennis, and he got a few million clicks. So, Rotarian guest, I would give the microphone to Dennis now, and he can bore you for the next 30 minutes.
Thanks, Dad. I'll give you the $50 later on. Can these lights come down? Oh yeah, Tom's on. Yeah, apparently that way you won't see me, but you'll see the pictures, and pictures are always far, far better. Now, I don't have my notes here, but I did read them a few days ago. So, and now the lights are off. As was said before, if you need to leave early, feel free to wake up and leave. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you all for coming to my 3-hour lecture this evening on the state of the travel industry. I will try to squeeze it into 30 minutes. That said, once we start peeling back the layers of the travel industry, this could go on forever. So we will have a bit of Q&A at the end. But as a bit of context, I'm speaking to you today with 3 hats on, which Frank, my father, alluded to. My opinions are my own, as opposed to any of the organisations I represent. They come from 30 years of experience in the industry and the family's unique ability to bullshit. Now, I'm one of the 3 Bunniks responsible for Bunnik Tours. And the good thing about this photo is it was done in more landscape. So the way that the picture here works, it's been elongated. So we're taller and slimmer here. So look at the pictures. My mother Marion, my brother Sasha, the 3 of us are the Bunniks behind Bunnik Tours. We run small group tours to many places around the world. For a while there it was just Australia, but now it's all over the world. Tonight is not a sales spiel for Bunnik Tours, so if anybody's got any questions, read Bunnik Tours, come and see me afterwards, and I'm happy to answer it. My second hat is my little YouTube channel. This is a hobby that's got out of hand. I'm what they call an av geek. We are the cooler versions of train spotters. It started a few years ago as a hobby. It has got out of hand. There's about 115,000 subscribers and 22 million hits. I do flight reviews and other bits and pieces. It keeps me busy on flights, and it's interesting. It does also allow me to do some really cool things. And during COVID, Qantas retired their 747 fleet, and they had a series of final passenger flights, joy flights, and I was on the very last one out of Canberra. And once the plane landed, all of us were, we spent an hour or so wandering around the plane, taking photos and stuff. It was actually really, really cool. Sadly, the 747s have all gone now. There's a few airlines that still have them, but you don't see them other than freighters flying here in Australia. This was the aircraft that no doubt many of you, or probably all of you, have flown at some stage. It opened Australia up to the world. It's democratised global travel. Talking YouTube, my brother, I've got to give him a plug. He was going to be here, so this is why I've done this. But actually, it is worth checking out. Him and his wife, my sister-in-law, started their own YouTube channel recently, doing travel videos. They've got some really cool videos there, including one they released a couple of days ago on Paris. So well worth checking out, the pastime tourists. My third hat is my role at Cato. For the past 8 years I've been the chair, and Dad says it's unopposed. That's true, because I'm the only idiot to stick my hand up. That's the reason it's been unopposed. But Cato, the Council of Australian Tour Operators, we represent the land supply sector of the Australian travel industry. So tour operators and wholesalers that design, create, market and ultimately deliver the holiday experiences that you buy through travel agents or direct from us, that allows you to see Australia and the world. AFTA represents the travel agents, Cato represents the tour operators. This gave me a ringside seat during COVID for the fight to save our industry. And well, actually wasn't ringside, because most of the time I was in the ring. And over the past few years I've become, together with a few others, a glorified government lobbyist. And that fight was fought on the airwaves, on the steps of Parliament, on TV, radio, in the halls of power in front of politicians, here in Adelaide with Simon Birmingham, or in Canberra in the press. Because ultimately, this was an industry worth fighting for. And I'll talk a little bit about that. An interesting time of my life. So tonight, I'm going to be talking about the travel industry. I'm going to be talking about what's happened in the last few years, and probably give you a little bit of context around some of the things that you've seen in the media in the past year, as Australia has opened up and the world has opened up and we've started travelling again. And hopefully allay some fears. So, that is out of proportion now. I can really see it there. Before COVID hit, Australia, the travel industry was absolutely booming. Each year, about 6.5 million holiday trips were made overseas by Australians. Now, I know some of you did more than one, right? That's 6.5 million trips. When you then add people going to see their friends and family, people travelling for work or for education, the total number of trips was about 11 million trips a year. Australia was, and is becoming again, a nation of travellers. Unfortunately, COVID hit, and overnight, all of that stopped. Ironically, the day that ScoMo announced that borders were closing was the 25th anniversary of the day that we started the business. So our 25th birthday was one to remember. Overnight, everything stopped. It stopped in terms of travel, that nobody could travel anymore, but it didn't stop for us in the travel industry. In those first few weeks, it was a frantic effort to try and get everybody home, within an environment, obviously, that the whole world was shutting down and flights were stopping. And then we had the massive and unenviable task of trying to undo a year's worth of advanced bookings within using a system that was never designed to operate in reverse. In the same way that your car doesn't travel as fast going backwards as it does going forwards, neither does the refund process. Add to that a world in a state of panic. Add to that the fact that the travel industry doesn't make any money until people actually travel, yet much of the work is done up to a year, 2 years in advance, especially when you're developing tours and cruises and routes and stuff like that, flight routes. No money, losing staff, and it was a pretty horrendous time. So you're going to we have the situation now, really, that there isn't anybody in the travel industry that isn't traumatised in some way. Right? The borders then open, crisis fatigue did set in, and we're now all overworked. But we're far, far happier now than we were when this photo was taken. And this was one of the trips I did to Sydney within the first couple of months of COVID. It was taken on a Tuesday afternoon on the flight from Sydney back to Adelaide. That is the Qantas terminal in Sydney. It remains the only time that I've ever seen that terminal without a single aircraft there. Now, if anybody has been there in recent times, often you now need to wait for a gate because there's so many aircraft there. So suddenly the world of travel stopped. This is just outside at Alice Springs Airport. 147 aircraft out there at its peak. Job losses around the world for the travel and tourism industry were horrendous. We lost over half of our staff. Travel agencies and travel businesses around the world closed. But I don't want to really dwell too much on that. I want to talk about what's happened since. But for those of you that are business minded, and I know there's a few in the room, is what are the key learnings from all of this? Because I can tell you, I wasn't a government lobbyist beforehand, and neither were any of the other people in the industry that I was involved in. We'd had a long-term relationship with the Department of Foreign Affairs, DFAT. In fact, Cato had been part of their travel industry, Smart Traveller Advisory Committee, and we'd worked with them when there are crises and for keeping Australians safe and helping them out when they get into trouble. We worked together there. But we had zero relationship with any other government department or politicians because we didn't need to. We were allergic to them. They left us alone, we left them alone, we all made money and it was good. Until suddenly we couldn't. Because the government, quite rightly so, at the time, made what we do illegal. Suddenly we weren't allowed to trade anymore. So what are some of the key learnings? Well, the first is that government relationships need to be multifaceted. That is, both with the administrative and the legislative arms, with the politicians, including the opposition, as well as the key government department. Treasury needs to understand why your industry is important, because if they don't, how are they going to help you? And that needs to be in place before a crisis. You don't want to start a crisis behind the eight ball. Spoiler alert, that's what we did. The second is that the government needs to have a very good understanding of how your industry works beforehand. Because politicians will say, well, no, now Australians can travel within Australia and all that money can stay here. But it wasn't until we started working with the ABS and Tourism Research Australia that we were able to show them that outbound leisure travel contributes $12 billion to the Australian economy every year and underpins about 30,000 jobs. Not only that, we provide the stimulus for airlines to fly here. You can't have planes flying only into Australia, not out. You know, they need to be full both ways. So you need to have both an incoming and an outgoing tourism industry. Plus, 80% of the freight coming in, and air freight coming into and out of Australia, travels in the belly of passenger aircraft. So it's all of these sorts of things that we were unfortunately having to educate them on the way through. The industry also needs a cross-sectional war cabinet before a crisis starts. Really, really important. We didn't have one. And the other big learning, federation doesn't work. Power tripping state premiers, I'll put it on the table now, became disillusioned with all sides of politics. The cruelty and the lack of empathy shown by some of our state premiers in their decisions was appalling. And that is that most politicians don't have empathy. In the sense that, and I understand it in some way, because they've always got people coming to ask them for stuff. So they're always having to say no. But the reality is that nothing happens until you can prove that there's good grassroots support. And either it's going to impact them on the ballot box, or they're going to get so embarrassed in the media that they have to do something. A good idea isn't going to get funded. So lobbying and fighting for survival is an endless and often thankless task that needed perseverance, tenacity, and a dose of luck. But as I said before, this is an industry worth fighting for, so this is what we did. So now let's talk about the good stuff. Eventually, ScoMo relented and thought that we couldn't go another Christmas without being kept apart from our families overseas or Australians being stuck overseas. So just before Christmas in 21, he opened the borders, but he only opened them halfway. The Australians overseas could come back and we could travel the world. It was fantastic. Those foreigners, they wouldn't be allowed in yet because no, they may be diseased. Okay. Pandering obviously to the local electorate. But what that did, it didn't do anything for consumer confidence. So whilst in theory we could all travel again, what the government was saying on one hand is, well, yeah, but it is still very dangerous, very, very dangerous out there. So the first people to be travelling were the visiting friends and relatives, the VFR market. And we all remember those wonderful Love Actually scenes and actually putting this together, choosing these photos and stuff, they're a bit emotional. Because that was probably the cruelest thing for COVID, wasn't the fact that we couldn't sell a tour to Egypt. Right? Because I understood the border closures, and the whole industry did as well. We were supportive of it. It was families being kept apart, weddings, funerals, births being missed, and that wasn't good. So this was really good to see. The second lot of travellers to start travelling were the business travellers, making up for lost time. The last group to start travelling were baby boomers going on small group tours. But that's all right, at least the borders were open. And over the course of 22, Bunnik Tours went from this to this. We finally managed to get people away. And I took this photo in October when I was in Egypt with this group. And it was an amazing experience. And what I'd like to do now is take you through that journey of what's changed and how travel changed over the course of 22 and where we are now and some of the difficulties that the industry has had and what it looks like going forward. I'm going to do that by showing you taking you through my journey. Obviously there was a fair bit of pent-up demand even with myself. So I gave it a red hot go. I did 82 flights last year. 141,849 miles. The blacker the line, the darker the line, is the more times I've done that flight. So 47 of those flights were domestic, but 35 of them were international. So what did that look like? Well, my journey started in late January and into February. We did our very first international tour back post-COVID. It was to Sri Lanka. And that was really important for us because we actually have our own office in Sri Lanka. It's a duplicate of our Adelaide office. And I accompanied that tour. What I became, instead of a government lobbyist, I became a tour guide and a cheerleader and morale officer for the travel industry, reporting back very gleefully of what it was like being out there exploring the world again. So Sri Lanka had a mask mandate in place, inside and outside, which means if you're outside, if you're climbing a mountain or working a field, you still had to wear a mask. We each had to show our vaccine certificates, do PCR tests before we left to show that we could fly, masks on the flight, and other bits and pieces of paperwork, health declarations for Sri Lanka. But it was a very small price to pay for that incredible sense of freedom and being able to explore the world. It was so good to be back. My video that I did on what my first flight was like post-COVID got 62,000 views for an economy class flight within about the first 5 days. I think half of that was the travel industry putting it on repeat. So even we're out on safaris at Yala, we were wearing masks. Sometimes we'd take the masks off for the photos, right? Because the marketing person in me thought, well, in 2 years' time, this is going to be a bit weird if we're all wearing masks outside. And the hotels and the local industry were so happy to see us. This was at one of the hotels. When we arrived there, they had traditional dancers and musicians and a whole load of staff there with king coconuts welcoming us. As you can see, the dancers had masks on. Now, if any of us had contracted COVID while we were there, this was in February, we would have been put into a government quarantine facility for 7 days. Luckily, we weren't. Right? None of us got COVID. From Sri Lanka, the group went home. I continued on to Cairo. We've got an office there as well, and caught up with the team. Hadn't seen them since pre-COVID. And the three of us were there and had a great time seeing them. There was no mask mandates in Egypt. Then I went on to Amsterdam to see the family. And over the course of that 4-week trip, 3 countries, I did 9 COVID tests. From my pre-departure test before I left Australia to the one I had to have on arrival at Adelaide Airport on the way back in. I had to show the vaccine certificate for every single flight, and I had to wear a mask at every single flight. But for me, that was a price worth paying. Then in May, I embarked on a 7-week trip. I went to Egypt, started in Egypt for a few days preparing for the restarting of our tours. I went to Jordan. As you can see, the influencers were out already, so they were some of the first travellers as well. You've got to get the right picture for the gram. Went to Jordan, to Petra. If you haven't been to Petra, put it on your list. It is magnificent. That Indiana Jones moment as you walk through the Sikh and you see the treasury for the first time. When I talk about it, it still makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. A little bit further into Petra is the monastery, which arguably is even more impressive. It is an incredible place. So I went to Egypt and Jordan, and then I went to Turkey, where I joined the first of 4 Bunnik tours, and this was the first 4 European tours. I joined them each for about a week to 10 days. It was a terrible job. It was a hard job, but somebody had to do it. So I stuck my hand up. And we have a maximum group size of 20. And there's about 8 or 10 on this tour. And that was it. There was a lot of nervousness. Right, so the tours didn't suddenly happen. Istanbul, fantastic. It's good as I've ever remembered it. Blue Mosque behind us there. Behind the photographer on this side is the Hagia Sophia, which is on the next photo. The local operator organised this fantastic cake. Again, so happy to finally be welcoming Australians back. For those of you who've been inside the Hagia Sophia, you'll know how incredible it is. They've been renovating over the last few years. All the scaffolding is now gone. It looks magnificent. Absolutely magnificent. They said they've now started renovating the Blue Mosque, so you walk inside the Blue Mosque and there's a lot of scaffolding. Even more incredible, or equally incredible, is ballooning over Cappadocia, which we did a few days later. Stunning, stunning part of the world. Now, there were 150 balloons up in the air on that May morning. It's very much tourism is back. Now, Australia was running about a year behind the USA, South America and Europe in terms of opening up. We obviously thought we should do a little bit better, but at least we weren't China or Japan, who were running about a year behind us. But tourism is back. And we were having a good time pretending to be influencers ourselves. The next tour I joined was the Jewels of Dalmatia, which is the former Yugoslavia, so Bosnia, Croatia, Slovenia. Again, beautiful part of the world. This photo really encapsulates that sense of freedom that we then felt. Now, Europe didn't have any mask mandates in place, but as you see, these 2 clients, who ironically were from WA, the Republic of Western Australia, they wore their masks pretty much everywhere, and that was fine. Other clients would wear masks when we were entering crowded areas, and some people didn't wear a mask at all. That was fine. And you're still seeing that now. The local food, this is in Sarajevo, lots of, Europe was back to normal. It was just so good. And you're going to see, obviously, lots of food and drink. We do like to have fun when we're travelling. Real beer. I went down to Morocco and joined one of our Morocco tours. And again there, life was normal. People were out enjoying themselves, and it was fantastic. Turns out, from a Bunnik tourist perspective, we were actually social distancing well before it became trendy. We've always had full-size coaches, maximum group size of 20. You know that really nice feeling you have when you get on an airplane and an empty seat next to you? We have that every day on the bus. There's a slight plug in there. Anyway, this is in Valencia. Again, just having lots of fun. Cuenca, I joined one of our Spain, Portugal, Morocco tours. That was the last one. And then I ended the trip in Lisbon. I haven't got a photo of Portuguese tarts. When I spoke at the Rotary conference a few years ago, I did spend a whole section on Portuguese tarts. I can tell you they're still as good as they ever were. The other reason I've got this photo on, you'll see that in Portugal, in public transport, people are wearing masks. Right? So at that stage, whatever the local conditions were, the local rules, that's what we abided by. But over that trip, 9 countries, 7 weeks, I only had to do 4 COVID tests. That included my pre-departure and the one that I had to do as soon as I got home. So in those few short months from February to May, June, the world was opening up and changing very rapidly. I still had to show my vaccine certificate when I crossed from one border, from one country to another. And on the international flights, I had to wear a mask. The domestic flights within Europe, they were optional. Now just 1 month later, and this is where Dad says he never knows when I'm in town or not, I had to go to America. I had to go because there was a travel conference on and I knew it would be a big party. It happened to be on in Vegas. I went to Seattle to look at some planes and I went to Vegas. Now the Americans dropped their need for a pre-arrival COVID test the week before I left. The Australians dropped their need for a COVID test before you come into Australia whilst I was over there. So that trip, 10 days, 0 COVID tests. On the flights with Air New Zealand on the way there, had to wear a mask and they policed that. And I did have to show my vaccine certificate. But again, it was getting easier. And we partied. It was fantastic, we were free. America was a bit like Europe in that, you know, people going, what COVID? It was a different world to what we were living here in Australia, and certainly what we were living here in Australia only 6 or 7 months prior to these photos being taken. So as I said, I gave it a really good go. But then, now you're all thinking, he got COVID and they all got COVID and they were sick and ended up in hospital. Turns out they didn't. No, I didn't get COVID. A few people did, but it was a bit, the worst was like a flu. For most, it was a cold for a few days. But for the travel industry, some other things started to happen in the middle of the year, and you would have seen them on TV, and they started to dent consumer confidence in a big way. People stopped booking travel when they started to fear not COVID, but the fact that their suitcases were unlikely to make it to their destination. When they realised they may need to wait for 5 hours between the time that they checked in to the time that they can get through security. Despite the fact that Alan Joyce tried to blame travellers as not being travel fit.
That was brilliant.
Yeah, that was a brilliant bit of marketing from him. He wasn't right. The blame here didn't lay with the consumers, or the public, the travelling public. It lay with the airports and with the airlines. Now, Australia wasn't immune. Sydney Airport had quite a few issues. Luckily, our groups travelling around the world, we didn't have any major issues. But London and London Heathrow and in Amsterdam Airport was absolute chaos.
Man.
So what had happened, beginning of COVID, the security staff were all laid off. The baggage handlers were laid off, or in the case of Qantas, outsourced. And those jobs are relatively low paid and relatively low skilled. Those people got jobs elsewhere. They were in no hurry to come back, especially when they saw this sort of stuff. They go, well, I'm not coming back. The airlines, yes, they probably didn't see travel coming back as strongly as it did in some parts, like in Europe. But in Australia, we had no excuse. Sydney Airport was sitting empty for 2 years. They did nothing about expanding the number of security lanes. It's only when the borders then opened that they think, oh, maybe we should build another couple. So we'll close these 3 down and start working on it. Meanwhile, I didn't have the staff either. So by the time they realised they needed to recruit, then recruitment took longer because nobody wanted to work those jobs, and then those people needed to be trained. You have a big school holiday period. Add to that some, an IT glitch or a storm or some delayed flights, and suddenly you've got a recipe for chaos. Now, as soon as the media smells something like this, they're straight onto it. So this was plastered all over the place. Whilst it was only local, it was only localised, the problems. So for the travel industry, we're again getting on the phone to the media going, what are you doing to us? You battered us for 2 years, you tried to help us a bit with the lobbying, and now you're doing this. We eventually got through, but then there was another problem. It turns out, when you park an aircraft in the desert, when you want to fly it again, it's not a case of going over there, putting the key in and turning it over. It takes a bit of time. These are complex pieces of machinery, and it's not good when they fall out of the sky. So it takes a long time to get an aircraft back up. And when you've sacked most of your pilots or laid them off, they can't just start work again. They need to be recruited, they then need to be trained. So it takes a long time for this to happen. Meanwhile, consumer demand went through the roof. So you get this sort of thing happening. Qantas having record profits. Now, as a quick aside, who saw the new Qantas business class and first class cabin they just released last week? Yes. Yeah. Who saw the fact that they're releasing a whole lot of new extra frequent flyer seats? Yeah. And who saw that they're now going to do free Wi-Fi on international routes? Yeah. All of that as a cover, right? To try and distract you from the fact that they just had $1.4 billion of profit because they've been price gouging all of us after they received $1.2 billion from the government, no strings attached, while the rest of the industry got crumbs. Anyway, sorry, I digress. If you want to know what I really think, the reality is that they knew people wanted to fly, and they couldn't bring planes back fast enough, so what they did is they kept increasing the prices, and people that were desperate enough, they wanted to see their families at Christmas. We're paying $5,000 in economy class to fly to the States or fly to Europe. They were paying $22,000 to $24,000 for business class to America or business class to Europe. Now, to put that into context, normally a business class airfare to Europe pre-COVID was about $6,000 or $7,000 at the cheap end. Sometimes you get a little bit less, but $7,000, $8,000. It's not worth $22,000 or $24,000, not at all. And interesting enough, you'll see the controversy here over the last few weeks about the government spending so much money on travel. Not the government's fault, because if the opposition had been in power, it'd be exactly the same. It was price gouging by the airlines. And the reality is that between July and December last year, international travel was down 41%. But our international capacity was down much lower than that. We still are not yet at the international flight capacity. Think about Adelaide. We used to have Emirates flying here daily. We used to have Cathay Pacific 4 times a week. They're now they're not back yet. They've got a freighter service. Malaysia Airlines thinks twice a week, but it used to be 5 times a week. So there's a lot of work a lot of time that's, a lot of work still needs to be done to get us back up and running. But these things didn't help, and therefore 22, whilst it was a fantastic year for the airlines and they made record profits, the rest of the travel industry struggled. But looking forward, things are looking very bright. Security staff have been recruited. Bags are now being lost at the same rate they were in 2018. Always take a photograph of your suitcase when you check it in. It makes it much easier when you're trying to describe it at the other end with baggage services. Those air tags are good if you want to know where your bag is. Right? It won't make the airline return it to you any sooner, but at least you'll know where it is. Every week at the moment, we're getting new announcements now that Japan and China are opening properly of more flights into Australia. which is fantastic. So we're seeing a downward pressure on airfares, and that will continue. Peak season, if you want to travel during the July school holidays this year to Europe, yes, it's going to cost you $4,000, $5,000 in economy class. But if you want to travel in May, come back in September, October, you can still get $1,700 to $2,200, $2,300 airfares in economy class. Right? And that is because some of these Korean airlines and the Japanese airlines and stuff are starting to put more fares out. Things like premium economy and business class, much harder to get at a cheaper rate. Because there is so much pent-up demand, we're seeing far more people flying business class and premium economy than we ever have. And we're also seeing people do back-to-back tours, going for longer holidays. There's this whole term around revenge travel. Right? ScoMo wouldn't let me travel for 2 years. I'm going to make up for it now. I did. So yeah, the new carriers, there's extra flights coming in all the time, and we're hopeful that eventually Emirates will come back as well. Cathay Pacific will come back before they do, but hopefully Emirates will come back. Certainly the travel industry, we're lobbying hard to get them back. There's one other factor that really influenced travel demand in this last year, and I'm going to use this tour to explain that. And that's something that's more inherent, and that is travel fear. This is our Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan tour. This was our fastest selling tour ever. We released it in 2019. Joanna Lumley, right, had just travelled along the Silk Road. She reported back from Baku and Tbilisi and Kazbegi and all these wonderful places, and we all lapped it up. We saw it on SBS or the ABC, whatever it was at the time. We happened to release this tour at the same time that was on. Pure coincidence. Within a matter of weeks, we'd sold out 10 departures. Right? 200 people. Fantastic. Really, really good. Then COVID hit, and we had to cancel them all. So a whole lot of people kept their deposits on file because they still wanted to go. Until a year ago, Putin decided to be a bit of a, I don't know how much I could swear here, but I know you. Yeah. And he invaded Ukraine. Now, so we talk about fear. Now, fear can come in many different forms. It can be fear of COVID, oh, I'm not going to fly, or I'm not going to go on a tour because Kevin Rudd said it was a floating petri dish. Ironically, cruising is booming. The fear I'm talking about here is just north of Georgia and Azerbaijan lies Russia. For context, we've got Turkey over here and Iran over there. Armenia and Azerbaijan have never got on. It's not a religious war. It's the fact that there's a few disputed mountains. This looks like a lake, but it's a couple of deserted mountains, which at the moment belong to Azerbaijan on paper, but Armenia's got control. Anyway, that flared up. So instead of this tour booming like we expected it to, it didn't sell. So my wife and I in August, we said, right, we'll put our names for the very first tour and we'll escort that. So in August we went. I tell you what, it was the best tour that I've ever done. We managed to get 20 people on it. Did we get kidnapped or attacked by the Russians? No. Did we catch COVID? No. Are any of the people on the tour happy that we went? They were absolutely delighted. Baku, it's oil rich. It's this show city. Like the Qantas plane evacuated, had to do an emergency landing there just before Christmas. And these people that were on that flight got to see this incredible architecture. It is a Muslim country, but they lived under Soviet rule for 50 years, so it's the most atheist Muslim country I've ever been to. The national drink is vodka. Right? The people here are really, really cool. So you've got this modern architecture, but then just out of the city, look how cool this bloke is with his Lada taxi. He was one of the guys at the bus parked at a service station. Then we got into these taxis and went out to see the mud volcanoes. Really cool. This is the bar at the hotel in the centre of Baku. It was incredible. I was playing dominoes with this old guy in a village in up in the Caucasus Mountains. Really, really nice. We then crossed over into Georgia and were introduced to their concept of the Toastmaster. So in a function like this or at a wedding, it's not everybody just having sips. When it's time to drink, and it is always time to drink, the Toastmaster would come out and do this elaborate toast. Like my father coming to do an elaborate introduction, it's like that, and everybody skulls. It's brilliant, really, really cool. Their love of life and their food there is just incredible. They invented wine here 8,000 years ago, and they're still making it using the same traditional methods. Georgia and Armenia are both Christian, the oldest Christian countries in the world. Food, fantastic. Nice bit of blatant branding there. So we ate and drank our way through Georgia, through Armenia, and through Azerbaijan. And we had so much fun. The Caucasus Mountains are the highest mountain range in Europe. Georgia has got 4 peaks over 5,000 metres. This is one of them, Kazbegi. Scenically, just stunning. This is one of the former capitals. This lady, talked before about people travelling longer. She did 4 of our tours back to back and then had a month by herself travelling through Turkey. She left in May, didn't come back until October. She was making up for lost time. So yes, scenically, fantastic. This is a monastery. That's Turkey in the background. This is in Armenia. It's the main market in Yerevan. Really nice food. And I want to talk about this. This was a special experience we did in Tbilisi. Tbilisi is the capital of Georgia. Now, Georgia's a tiny country. It's got a massive neighbour that has been a bit of a bully. For the last 250 years, Russia has not honoured a single treaty that it has signed with Georgia. Not once. Yeah, even today, about 10% of the country is controlled by Russia. It's a remote area up in the mountains. We don't go near it, but that's where it is. Anyway, in Tbilisi, we had this private tour of this art gallery, this private little art gallery. The artist had passed away and his family have turned his former apartment into a gallery. We had some cheese and wine and it was really nice, and we had a tour. And then we had this wonderful classical musical performance. And we were in one of those old terrace houses, like something out of Paris in the 1920s. It was just a really nice moment. And what we like to do on our tours is have these connections with local people. So in Denmark, we dine with a Dane. In Tokyo, we have lunch with a sumo wrestler. As an aside, that's where I found out sumo wrestlers are sex symbols in Japan. When you're having lunch with them, you can ask them any question you like, and that's the question I asked them. Anyway, here the guest speaker was Alexei Pietravilli or something. It's a long name. He was the foreign minister of Georgia in charge of European and North Atlantic integration between 2012 and 2014. At the time, he was the one negotiating with his boss, the foreign minister, with Angela Merkel and the Germans and the Europeans for Georgia to be admitted to the EU. It was a fascinating talk. We had an hour and 20 minutes with him. And he spoke about the geopolitics. He spoke about the 250 years of Russia never abiding by a treaty. He spoke about gaining independence from the Soviet Union and how hard that was, and how at the time all energy was controlled out of Moscow. So the first thing Moscow did was cut everything off. And they had power for 1 hour a day. And the hardship and all of that stuff. He spoke about geopolitics and then spoke about Ukraine and the situation there. And we got an insight that we never get from the media here, because the media here is not interested in Georgia or Armenia or Azerbaijan unless something major happens, like a Qantas plane lands in Baku unannounced. So we asked, what was his opinion on the Ukraine, Is Poland next, or Moldova, or Georgia? And is there a risk? And he goes, well, no. That, you know, in his opinion, Russia's struggling with the Ukraine. They've had to pull back the number of fronts that they've got there. They physically do not have the capability to open up another front with another country. And obviously that would cross yet another line. So, and what you find, and I know you're all a bit sensitive, so the photos I took of the F. Putin graffiti that I found on the streets of Tbilisi, I haven't included in the presentation, but you can just imagine it. There's a lot of Russians avoiding conscription in Georgia at the moment. But whilst there were some European tourists there weren't many tourists throughout Georgia, Armenia, or Azerbaijan. So it was actually the best time to see it. And it reminded me of Egypt. You know, when the revolution hit in Egypt, we were doing 120 groups a year to Egypt. The Arab Spring came, so that stopped, and it dropped 90% overnight. It took 8 years for Egypt to fully recover. It wasn't until 2018 that suddenly Australians went there en masse again, and it was really, really busy. The best time to visit Egypt was not in 2018-19 when everybody else was there. It was in 2015-16, 4 years after the last of the upheavals of the Arab Spring and the coups and stuff they had in Egypt, that had 2 or 3 years of stability. I was there with groups, and several times there would be only 5 or 6 of us inside a tomb in the Valley of the Kings. And now I had it once a year after the revolution that I was the only person inside one of those tombs. That's freaky. But when you're there and you can see Egypt, and you can see the hieroglyphics, and you're the only, you know, if there's 5 or 6 of you, the only ones in that tomb, that's the way to see Egypt. When you can stand in front of Tutankhamun's death mask, and you don't have 20 or 30 people around you, that's the way to see it. Unfortunately, human nature doesn't work that way. Because, oh, you're going to go to Egypt, your neighbour, your hairdresser, your family, friends are going to say, oh, you're going to get blown up. Well, you're not. Our job is to keep you safe. Remember, we work with DFAT to make that happen. So the best time to visit Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan was this year. The next best, or last year. The next best time is to visit it next year. If you wait another 5 years, it's going to be completely overrun, right? Because it is one of these new destinations. I was in Egypt in October, and it was packed. There are now lineups in those tombs at the Valley of the Kings, and it's great. You can still see the hieroglyphics, but you're shuffling along like this. No Australian tourists were there, just our group, because Australians are too scared to go to Egypt. The Europeans, the Americans, they're not. Next year, this year, the Chinese and the Japanese won't be there yet, but 24 they will be. So I'm going to finish with these slides, and this is the Valley of the Kings in Egypt, and it really drives home this point. This is James. He's our product manager. South America is his baby, together with Mum. He was a tour guide in South America for a number of years. Adelaide lad came back and has been selling South America forever, has been there many, many times. He's been there for the last 4 weeks, doing an inspection, because we know we've got to restart tours to South America, but Peru's been in the news because the locals weren't happy with election results, and there was riots, and Machu Picchu was closed for about 4 weeks. It reopened 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. So James has gone to have a look to see what it's like. Now this was taken in the Sacred Valley. He said, it's no different now to when I was there pre-COVID and when I was working there. Right? The protests have stopped, because if the protests were still ongoing, we wouldn't be running tours there. But I can tell you, based on normal performance, we're going to sell bugger all South America this year. We'll sell a few next year, and the year after, suddenly it'll be swamped. Meanwhile, everybody else will be in there. And this is where I say, if you've got something on your bucket list, and you've always wanted to go, We lost 2 years due to COVID. Many lost a third year due to fear. And I say, my big travel tip, don't lose a fourth. There is nothing that should be stopping you. If you want to travel, the world is out there. The world is traveling. And if you happen to want to do that with Bunnik Tours, fantastic. If not, do it with somebody else, but get out there and explore the world, because time does stop. The world doesn't. It keeps going. So that's it from me. Nobody left. Is that what you want to say? There is a roving mic here. Or are you going to sing a song?
Underneath. Do you want one of your pairs of glasses?
Hello, is this working?
No, try the other one.
Well, we've got the IT department looking at the microphone. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, it's on.
Okay. Is there anybody who would like to ask some questions to Dennis?
Yep.
Yeah. I had a question about capacity. How do you determine capacity? Given that Bernard Salt made an observation about how, if you look at the increase of flights around the world, there's a direct correlation between flights and pandemics. And so, how are we safeguarding ourselves to make sure we're not going to have another pandemic in a few years' time?
There's guaranteed to be another pandemic at some stage. The last big one was the Spanish flu in 1918, and every 100 years or so, something like that will happen. Obviously, the advent of flight makes that makes it spread quicker, right? So COVID went through the world quicker than what Spanish flu did at the time. What happened after September 11 is the world of travel changed and security changed. There's a whole lot of things that we take for granted never happened before September 11. You could take box cutters and, security on domestic flights was almost non-existent. So with each crisis, there are learnings and safeguards in place. And that's why you still see a lot of people wearing masks and things like hand sanitizers. The interesting thing during all of this, the COVID years and this year of travelling since, is the incidence of respiratory illness, colds and flus on tour is much, much lower than what it was. Yeah? We used to always, we'd be telling people, wear your seatbelts, wear your seatbelts. Now I say, your insurance company won't pay unless you're wearing a seatbelt, and me telling you this has now shifted responsibility from me to you. That worked there. I could talk to, I was blue in the face about sanitising and stuff like that. People now understand it. And on tour, we actually have sanitizer, and I would walk up the bus, squirting people at times, and everybody put their hands out. So, yeah, but there's no guarantee. It's a bit like terrorism. There is no guarantee, but there are safeguards in place. In terms of the thing about capacity, the question there is, it's the number of seats available on a weekly basis internationally out of Adelaide or out of Australia, compared to what it was previously. And the Chinese carriers had a lot of capacity out of Australia.
Thanks very much for your talk. Do you have a take on Central Africa and where they are at this point in the travel regime?
Central Africa is in like East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda.
Yeah. Kenya, Tanzania.
They're all selling really, really well. Annalika, our general manager, who is as much a lover of Africa as James is of South America, was there for a month late last year, and yes, things are open. The thing about safaris in those places, they're all in very remote areas. So you're not in big population bases, whereas if you're traveling in Europe, you're with the crowds. If you're an African safari, you're generally with 6 or 12 people. The other thing you've noticed though, that Africa is selling really, really well. Our tours in September, October, which is sort of the peak season for Kenya, Tanzania, sold out last year. And that's the thing that I was talking about, the bucket list. The bucket list destinations are the ones that are really starting to sell this year. Where people are going, right, I've always wanted to go to Africa and do a safari, I'm going to do that first. Does that answer that question? Yeah.